On October 14th, 1943, at around 4 in the afternoon, Sobibor Deputy Commandant Johann Niemann entered the camp tailor shop. He had been invited there for a fitting. Within minutes, Niemann was killed with an axe. But the most important thing was not what happened inside the workshop. Outside, the camp was still functioning according to its usual routine. Guards remained in their towers. Prisoners continued working. Other SS men had no idea that one of the most important figures in the camp administration was already dead. That was what the entire plan depended on. Not defeating the garrison in open combat, not smashing through the gates in the first attack, but forcing the Sobibor system for a short time to continue operating as if nothing had happened, while inside it, one after another, the men capable of giving orders disappeared. There was only one question. How long could that chain hold before it broke? If stories of Jewish resistance that were ignored for far too long matter to you, like the video and subscribe. And now, back to Sobibor. Sobibor cannot be understood as an ordinary prison camp. It was a German Nazi extermination center established in occupied Poland as part of Operation Reinhardt, the program for the mass murder of the Jews of the general government. From the spring of 1942 until October 1943, at least 167,000 people were murdered there. Most deportees did not become camp prisoners in the usual sense. They were transported there to be killed. A small number were temporarily selected for forced labor, sorting the possessions of those who had been murdered, repairing clothing, working in workshops, and maintaining the camp infrastructure. These people received something that almost none of those arriving on the transports had: time. But that time did not mean safety. They were witnesses to the machinery of extermination, and they understood that their own lives depended on whether the camp still needed them that particular day. Sobibor's layout made a mass escape extraordinarily difficult. The camp was divided into separate zones. One contained the barracks of the prisoner laborers, another held warehouses filled with looted property and various workshops. A separate area containing the gas chambers and mass graves was isolated from the rest. Order was maintained by several dozen German and Austrian SS men and around 120 guards trained at Travniki. Around them were fences, watchtowers, and minefields. That meant the idea of simply running away solved almost nothing. Even if one person managed to reach the outer perimeter, there were still guards, fire from the towers, mines, and the manhunt that would follow. More importantly, individual escapes did nothing to save the hundreds of people who remained inside. By the spring of 1943, an underground resistance group already existed in the camp, which organizer was Leon, or Leiber, Feldhendler, the Polish Jew deported to Sobibor from Izbica. His group was not collecting abstract secrets. They were gathering the kind of information without which an escape could not be planned: the structure of the camp, daily routines, SS movements, and guard shift schedules. Before Pechersky arrived, the resistance already knew how costly a mistake could be. During the summer, prisoners from an isolated section where people were forced to work with the bodies of the murdered tried to prepare an underground escape route. The tunnel was discovered, and those involved were killed. On July 23rd, another escape took place. 2 prisoners from a forest labor detail killed a guard, after which others also attempted to flee. German gendarmerie records documented the escape of 28 Jews. Most of those involved were captured and killed. Every attempt proved the same thing. The wall around Sobibor was not merely physical. The camp's command system itself had to be broken, even if only for a few minutes. And in September, a man arrived in Sobibor who knew how to think in exactly those terms. Alexander Pechersky was a Soviet Jew and an officer in the Red Army. He was captured by the Germans in 1941, passed through several prisoner-of-war camps, and in September 1943 was among a group of Jews transported from Minsk to Sobibor. The Sobibor Museum and Memorial states that the transport contained around 2,000 Jews. 80 people were selected for labor. Pechersky and a group of Soviet prisoners of war were among them. This became the first important link in the chain that would follow. Feldhendler and his men knew the camp from the inside. They knew who worked where the workshops were located, when roll calls took place, and which SS men came to the tailors, shoemakers, or warehouses. Pechersky and the other Soviet POWs brought what the underground had been missing: military experience, discipline, and the ability to construct a unified plan involving hundreds of people. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that within several weeks of his arrival, Pechersky developed a detailed plan for the uprising. The goal had to remain mass escape, but the circle of people who knew the full plan had to stay small. If every prisoner was told everything, the risk of a leak would multiply. If too few people were involved, there would not be enough participants to carry out the individual tasks. So most prisoners did not know the complete plan until the very end. Pechersky proposed that they not begin with the gates. First, they had to deprive the camp of part of its command structure, quietly, one man at a time. SS personnel would be summoned to different workshops under believable pretexts to try on clothing, collect an item that had been made for them, or inspect valuable property. Once inside, they would be killed with edged weapons, so that gunfire would not immediately trigger an alarm. Then the prisoners would have to seize weapons and use the camp's ordinary routine against it. In the version of the plan described by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Soviet POWs were supposed to obtain the uniforms and weapons of the dead SS men and, during evening roll call, attack the guards near the gates and watchtowers. In other words, the uprising had to look, for as long as possible, like it was not an uprising at all. That was the second link. Do not allow the camp to realize that it was already under attack. The date mattered as well. On October 14th, Commandant Franz Reichleitner and several other important members of the camp staff were absent. Gustav Wagner, one of the Sobibor SS men particularly feared by the prisoners, was also away from the camp that day. For the conspirators, that meant fewer people capable of rapidly restoring control. But the absence of several SS men did not make the task simple. Armed guards were still present. There were watchtowers, gates, and mines. The conspirators possessed almost no firearms. The first minutes, therefore, had to unfold almost perfectly. On October 14th, at around 4 o'clock, the first phase began. Niemann entered the tailor shop and was killed. He was the deputy commandant, and with Reichleitner absent, he was an especially important target. Elsewhere in the camp, SS man Josef Wolf was lured into a warehouse containing clothing stolen from murdered victims, supposedly to try on a coat. He too was killed with an axe. Over roughly the next hour, the conspirators continued summoning SS personnel one by one. It is especially important not to turn the uprising into the story of a single man. Pechersky coordinated the plan, and Feldhendler was one of the underground leaders, but dozens of prisoners carried out individual assignments. Soviet Jew Arkady Weisspapier acted together with 17-year-old Polish Jew Yehuda Lerner. According to Yad Vashem, the two killed 2 SS men. Chaim Engel, a Polish Jew and former soldier in the Polish army, also took part in killing a guard and later managed to escape. For a time, the unbelievable happened almost exactly as the organizers had hoped. One man disappeared, then another, and still no general alarm was raised. And this is the moment when the plan almost begins to look reliable. But it was never reliable. We have reached the halfway point of this story. If you believe it is important to restore to memory not only the names of victims but also those who resisted, tell us in the comments what strikes you most about this story and support the video with a like. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the most dangerous part of the plan had already produced results. Several members of the camp administration were dead, but the next phase was something no one could fully control. Not every intended target went where he had been summoned. Not all the weapons could be obtained. Not everyone capable of obstructing the escape could be eliminated quietly. And above all, time was working against the prisoners. The longer the SS men remained missing, the greater the chance that someone would start looking for them.
This was where the chain began to break.
According to the original calculation, the prisoners were supposed to use roll call to approach the exit in an organized formation and only then launch the next attack. But the remaining camp personnel realized that something was happening. As the prisoners began to gather, the guards opened fire. From that moment, the plan ceased to be a precise timetable. That does not mean it failed. In fact, this is where its real success becomes clear. During the previous hour, the conspirators had managed to do something that would have been almost impossible in an open uprising. They had put a significant part of the German staff out of action before the general shooting began. The camp had lost men who knew the system, commanded the guards, and could rapidly coordinate a response. A series of individual killings created a gap between the moment the uprising began and the moment the administration understood its scale. That was the brief window for which the entire plan had been constructed. Now hundreds of prisoners understood what was happening. Returning to an ordinary roll call was impossible. Remaining inside meant almost certain death once the conspiracy had been suppressed. So the organized plan turned into a mass breakout. Prisoners rushed toward the fences and exits. Some members of the resistance had captured weapons and returned fire, but the main exit was inaccessible, forcing many to break through barbed wire and the minefield. Some were shot from the towers. Others were killed by mines. Those who reached the forest were still far from safe. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, of approximately 600 prisoners present in Sobibor on the day of the uprising, around 300 succeeded in breaking out of the camp. A large-scale manhunt followed, involving SS units, police, and German military forces. At least around 100 escapees were captured and killed. Approximately 50 survived until the end of the war. These numbers must be stated without turning them into a comforting legend. Half the camp did not simply reach the forest and disappear safely. The escape cost an enormous number of lives. People died during the breakout itself, in the minefield, and during the manhunts. Some were later betrayed or murdered elsewhere in occupied territory. But without the uprising, the fate of those retained in Sobibor as forced laborers had effectively already been determined by the camp's very purpose. The extermination center was reducing its operations. Prisoners saw what had happened to other labor detachments and feared the liquidation of the final witnesses. In clothing belonging to prisoners transferred from Belzec and murdered at Sobibor, workers even discovered notes containing warnings and appeals to act. After October 14th, the system could no longer return to its previous operation. All prisoners who remained inside the camp were killed. Soon afterward, the Germans began dismantling Sobibor. Jewish prisoners from Treblinka were brought in to demolish the structures. Once the work was completed, they too were murdered. The gas chambers were destroyed, the ground was ploughed, and parts of the site were planted with trees in an attempt to conceal evidence of the crime. The uprising, therefore, did not liberate the camp in a military sense. The Red Army did not enter Sobibor on October 14th. The garrison did not surrender. But something else happened. An extermination center created for the mass murder of Jews became the site of a mass Jewish revolt, after which its operation ceased. The Sobibor Memorial directly connects the end of the camp's functioning with the prisoners' uprising. Pechersky escaped. He later joined Soviet partisans and continued fighting Nazi Germany. But when telling the history of Sobibor, it is important not to turn him into a lone hero who somehow saved everyone. He could not save everyone, and the uprising was not his personal operation. Without Feldhendler and the underground, there would have been no accumulated knowledge of the camp. Without the Soviet POWs, there would have been no military group capable of carrying out synchronized assignments. Without the tailors, shoemakers, warehouse workers, and other prisoners, it would have been impossible to lure SS men into places where they could be killed without immediately triggering an alarm. Without the hundreds of people who chose to break out at the decisive moment, the plan would have remained nothing more than a series of secret killings. That is why the central question of this story is not, how did Pechersky invent the perfect escape? There was no perfect escape. The plan began breaking down before the prisoners even reached the gates. Not every target was eliminated. They failed to seize all the weapons they needed. The guards realized what was happening earlier than the organizers had expected. Instead of a controlled departure, a chaotic breakout began under fire. But the plan held for exactly as long as it needed to. It created an interval during which part of the camp administration had already been killed, while the entire garrison had not yet begun acting as a single coordinated force. In those minutes, the prisoners moved from a secret conspiracy known to only a few people to a mass uprising that could no longer be stopped by a single order. On October 14th, 1943, Sobibor did not prove that escaping from a death camp was somehow easy, nor that resistance guaranteed survival. It proved something more difficult and more precise. Even inside a system specifically designed to strip people of every choice, prisoners managed to create their own moment of action. Sobibor had been created as a place where Jews were transported to be murdered, and from which the overwhelming majority were never supposed to emerge alive. But that day, around 300 prisoners broke out, and approximately 50 survived until the end of the war. Their escape became possible not because the plan was flawless, but because its most important part succeeded before the entire camp system understood what was happening. That is why the Sobibor uprising remains one of the most important stories of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Not a story of miraculous rescue, a story of people who understood the cost of failure, constructed an impossibly fragile chain, and managed to move far enough along it before it broke. If you want to see more documentary stories like this, subscribe, like the video, and share it. And in the comments, tell us what you believe is most important to remember about Sobibor: the scale of the crime, the organization of the uprising, or the lives of those who managed to survive.